What's up, everyone? Let us get to Friday again. So that means it's time for another episode of the newly called LeafCast. I don't even know what to call this one, really. There's gonna be a lot of stuff in this one, hopefully. So, hopefully you'll enjoy it. If this is your first time watching the third video that I do every week, then this video is a little different than the other videos I do. This one's more conversational. So I figured to start us off, I'll talk about some crawler stuff. Now, all of you are probably familiar with crawlers and the encounters that go with them, but if you're not, a crawler is typically a pale humanoid, usually with not much of any facial features, and if they do, they have really small, beady black eyes. They're known to be really strong. In some cases, people believe they can shapeshift. There's lots of different differentiating factors between encounters, but the most common thing is that they are tall. They're skinny, they're humanoid looking, like almost human, and they're extremely pale. So to start us off, I'll go with this one. Okay, for starters, I did not believe any of this was real until after midnight last night. I believed everyone was just making things up and having communities like this to be apart for shits and giggles, essentially. However, last night I saw something that I could not and still cannot explain. I live in Noonan, Georgia. My house is very rural and surrounded by woods on all sides and farms on my side of town. I did not know much about these crawlers other than the basic mainstream stuff going around. I didn't believe it was real. I messed with my girlfriend about it all the time to scare her as jokes. I frequently mentioned their actual name. The one before, a lot of them became called crawlers. However, on this night I got back to my house around 2 a.m. I was on FaceTime with my girlfriend while I was driving home. However, upon arriving, and on about 80% battery I might add, my phone shut off and would not work. I didn't think anything of it, however. I get out of my truck and my dogs started going absolutely crazy, barking and growling aloud. They only bark at people they don't know, as they are livestock guardians and don't pay animals they don't see as threats any mind. Anyways, while they were barking, I hear what sounds like a fake barking noise behind me, almost like a person trying to sound like a dog bark. But if that person had never tried and was just really bad at it, it made my hair stand up on end because I had assumed that it was a person in the woods behind me. I turned towards the sound and I saw nothing. The sound happens again, and when I look into the direction, I saw a creature I'll never forget. It was hunched on all fours. It had a gray, human-ish face, large dark black eyes that reflected brightly when light was shined on it, and no mouth. It was a human-like body, but with patches of fur throughout, fur not covering the whole body. I don't know any more details because as soon as I looked it in the eyes, it bolted toward me. I jumped in my truck and bolted. No more chasing. I called my grandmother, who lives in the woods, to give me an extra set of eyes, just so I know that I'm not crazy. She, who had always been adamant that nothing exists paranormally, said that she had been worked up by my dogs barking throughout the woods, and then heard a very high-pitched scream that sounded human and animal-like. We sat in the driveway and half-heartedly looked through the woods in the direction of the sighting. We began to hear a grunting at a different point in the woods, loud grunting, kind of like a deer in a rut. We turned to listen, and then it started behind us. Then, the scream that she heard before was changing directions around us. We had to turn to hear it each time. I couldn't sleep after going inside. I locked all the windows and doors, and then heard a tapping and a knocking on my bedroom for about an hour. After falling asleep, finally, I had reoccurring nightmares of that thing watching me and hunting me from different places. Maybe you can help me ID it. It sounds like, you know what, but I live nowhere near Navajo land, nor do I know any Navajo. I am myself part Cherokee and Cree, but only about 15%. After all these sounds and what I saw, I will no longer be going outside in the woods at night. So as you can imagine, this would be a very terrifying encounter for anybody to have. I almost think that if you didn't believe in the paranormal, that it would be more terrifying that way. Because if you do believe in the paranormal, and you read about it, even casually, you kind of know, just even surface level knowledge, you can kind of tell this is that, and things like that, and you may know how to get rid of them. But in this case, this person has never experienced anything like this before, and judging by what he said about his grandmother, neither had she. So you can only imagine how jarring it would be to essentially have your whole worldview just shattered in front of you. Like all of this is real, this thing is right in front of me. And as I mentioned before, it had a lot of the hallmarks, but instead of white, it was grayish skin, and there were some bits of fur on it as well. Instead of small black eyes like I mentioned, there was large ones. But as you can see, the same general description of these beings remains the same. So you really have to wonder, what exactly are they? Someone mentioned to me, and I don't know if it's the same thing or if it's even relevant to this, but someone said that in the Jewish Bible, there are things called the Shadim, I believe they were called. It's like the almost humans, or the things that were left over when humans were created. I'm probably getting that wrong, but the way they described them to me was almost like a crawler. And this person could have just been stringing me along, of course, but I just thought that it was really interesting how it's possibly mentioned in really old texts. And not as old, obviously, but on the Sunday video, you'll hear about a similar thing that has a kind of a mythological background. So make sure you tune in for that one. And I have another, much shorter encounter with a crawler, or I think it's a crawler anyways. So the guy says that he's about 7 or 8 years old, and he was just playing outside, as all kids usually do. And it's mentioned that this house is close to the woods and has trees on 3 sides of it, and at the time of this encounter, it was getting close to sundown. Now, he thought he saw his dad at the tree line, just standing there, so he yells, "Daddy," or something similar, and started walking toward what he thought was his father. And as he's walking toward him, something seems just not right. The figure seems to almost change, not to transparency or anything, but seems to reveal itself as just being something with very pale skin. And when he sees this, he turns and runs faster than he ever has before. When he gets inside, his dad is inside smoking a cigarette, watching the History Channel. He goes over to the window to see just what the hell it was outside, if his dad was in the room all along. And when he goes over to look out the window, he sees nothing. The figure that he had seen previously seems to have just vanished, probably back into the woods. So one question here is simple. What do you think were the intentions of the entity trying to draw a kid out into the woods? Because I've read some of these encounters, and you'll probably see them in upcoming videos, where they don't do anything. They just like to screw with you, draw you out into the woods and get you lost, and then that's about it. They don't show up again. Or in this case, maybe he wanted to draw him out into the woods to get lost, and then who knows what. So this next one comes from Utah in the Uinta Mountains. So let me clarify, this was 9 years ago, when I was 15, on a muzzleloader's mule deer hunt in the far northeastern part of Utah, which contains some of the most remote and beautiful places in the state. I've frequently been out in this area spreading in Summit County that cuts in and out of lower Wyoming since before I can remember, including lots of hiking, backpacking, camping, hunting, and being involved in some of my grandfather's work. I am skeptical of things not proven by science, but I don't deny all of those things. I find that it's impossible for science to know of all there is out in our vast world. My grandfather is a recently retired biologist and former conservation officer for the state, and was a regional specialist, and was over wildlife and habitat management for many years. He's done everything from habitat management programs, controlled fires to benefit areas, to quite literally wrangling moose to be transplanted and darting black bears. He has seen mountain lions, bears, birds of all kinds, small mammals, ruminants, plants, and natural phenomena for a majority of his life, and he understands so much that many people, including myself, will never be able to imagine. He's scientific, honest, and straightforward, and level-headed. He's agnostic and is not superstitious, and is often used to, lovingly and respectfully, teasing a certain CO who thinks Bigfoot, skinwalkers, and other things exist. Other than this experience, he has never encountered an animal that he could not at least partially, if not completely, identify. And other than the natural, innate fear of being in close quarters with a bear, drunken and belligerent hunters, or an incredibly potent tranquilizer medication, he's told me over and over that he's never been terrified of an animal or experience like this, only curious or surprised. It was late September, and we were in a small camp by a lake in the high Uinta Mountains, hunting both grouse and mule deer with muzzleloaders. The camp was a small collection of men and women my grandfather had worked with over the years as a supervisor, biologist, and CO, and these were people that I grew up with. One of the women, a new wife to one of the guys, had shot a buck deer, injuring it, but not killing it immediately, and they had lost track of it. Devastated by the thought of wasting the animal, she returned to camp in the afternoon, upset and concerned that the deer had run into an even more secluded area of the mountain, which was hard to reach from the trail that she had shot it from, a place my grandfather was familiar with only because it was such a pain in the ass to get to, with lots of deadfall and steep terrain. We volunteered to go in the late afternoon to search for the deer, following a scant blood trail that she had tracked for a while before getting fatigued and intimidated by the terrain. Because both my grandfather and I were in good shape and he was so familiar, it didn't seem like a big deal. Before we left, she mentioned hearing what she assumed was coyotes, which made her even more concerned that if the deer had died, they would ruin the meat and hide before she could harvest it. We took off in the early evening, expecting to be back within an hour or two after searching and having our guns on us, in case we found the animal still alive or came across another buck worth trying to harvest. It was steep in places, with lots and lots of deadfall of varying heights, making the hike slower and more tedious than we had hoped, making us understand the other hunter's fatigue. She had marked the blood trail with bright orange pieces on the trees, which we followed for maybe 20 minutes, and then it got very hard to track. The sun was getting close to setting at this point, and we knew that getting out was going to be just as long as getting in. We had just about decided to stop when we found a spot near a fallen tree that looked like it had been recently bedded down in, followed with spatters of fairly fresh blood, and we continued for longer. When the sun had just about set and the light had faded behind the trees, we removed the firing caps from our guns to make them now completely safe, as it was now illegal and responsible to hunt in such an absence of decent light. My grandfather pulled out his large Maglite flashlight from his pack, and I and my headlamp to begin the hike back, using our GPS to find the trailhead. About 10 minutes on the way back, we started to hear something, more movement among the trees. It was normal for animals to start moving now that the sun had gone down, as animals would likely be starting to head towards clearings for water or to graze in the safety of lower light. There were small and distant sounds of crunching leaves, patterings of hooved animals, or bits of movement in the trees from squirrels or birds that were common and expected. We did not expect the deafening, disturbing sound we heard next, which vaguely and initially reminded me of a coyote howl, but by a few seconds in, it was unidentifiable, frightening, and almost human-like. It started with what sounded like a person screaming, but then got louder and more intense with a screech to it. It was so unlike any coyote or animal we had ever heard. Then was the almost chittering that came in between the shrieks and the movement of the trees becoming almost calculated, almost threatening. We stopped dead in our tracks, frozen as my grandfather started using the light to look around. I was far more freaked out than him at this point. He just seemed perplexed, curious, and a little baffled at just what could make that sound. It sounded human, but with no words, with no urge of tone, of help, or I'm just screaming to mess with you. We continued on. It seemed like the other natural and distant sounds had almost gone silent. I listened intently to the sound of my boots crunching with the dry aspen leaves underfoot, trying to tell myself that it was just some weird coyote with a horribly deformed larynx or something. Maybe 20 minutes from the main trail that would lead us back to the truck, we heard the chittering sound again and sounds of thumping against dead trees. Looking around with our lights, in between the deadfall of maybe 12 to 15 feet in front of us was a large, human-looking thing. It was almost hunched down, with a long, slender arm around the front of a standing aspen. The aspen, of course, was pale white, with knots being dark brown, and whatever it was had skin almost as pale. I caught a very brief glimpse of its face. It seemed round, and the eyes seemed sunken, and I could not tell you the eye color other than a flash of a reflection on the eye from my light, and that its face seemed sunken and emaciated. I didn't see any fur or hair. I never felt like it looked right at me, more my grandfather, and just in our direction, almost confused and curious. For a mere couple of seconds that I caught a glimpse of it, but that was it. I looked down at the ground, holding my eyes shut tight, trying to imagine being safe and secure in the truck, and my grandfather took a few stumbling steps backward toward me. I heard the thing go off to our side, moving quickly and with purpose through the trees, to the side, and then drop down behind us, I would assume according to the sound, but I hoped that it went in the opposite direction. My grandfather turned to where it had veered off as to follow it, but he soon stopped and looked at me. I had never before, and never since, seen him so confused, baffled, and horrified, curious, and in awe. I was crying at this point, ugly crying, trying to muffle my shaking breath and voice. I asked him, "What was that?" Over and over I asked, and he had no answer for me. He pulled his gun off his shoulder, a sling, and put the cap back on the nipple of the lighter, making the gun live, and then he carried it in front of his body in his arm. He pulled out another headlight to put on himself. We started walking again toward the trail, as he listed off, like talking to himself, as to what it wasn't. Things like, couldn't have been a deer, or an elk, or a moose. It had arms. It was hunched. It stood upright. A bear? A very sick bear. It could have been, maybe a bear. Was it the light? We heard the sound, the screeching human howl, distantly, just once more, before reaching the trail, which was dirt and gravel, but fairly flat and no deadfall. We practically jogged back to the truck. I locked the doors immediately and sobbed. My grandfather turned on music as loud as possible to try to distract me on the way back to camp. I was a mess when we arrived back, and he went in to talk with the others by the fire. He got me settled in my sleeping bag in my bunk. He explained to some of his friends, but I don't know what was all said. The next day, everyone was extra sweet to me, trying to comfort me, and saying that it was probably a sick animal that looked scary in the dark. The deer the hunter shot was found the next day in the daylight, scavenged quite harshly by what we assumed was coyotes. To this day, he has no clue what it was, nor what that sound was, and before and since I've heard both coyotes and many other animal sounds that never even compared to that sound. The scientist in me and in him, the hopeful and blissfully ignorant people in us, hope and speculate that it was just a deformed, sick animal in scant light, but I still have no clue of what that thing was, and I hope I never experience it again. Does anybody have any ideas? Am I in the right place here? Is there a chance that this thing could be a crawler? So once again, you can only imagine how terrifying that experience was, especially for both people involved, and once again, they weren't believers in the paranormal or anything of the type. I could be completely wrong in thinking that it's scarier if you're not a believer than if you are. People always talk about their first experience being their scariest, but in some cases it's not. And as I mentioned earlier in the video, this also had a similar description. It was pale and or gray. It looked humanoid, and it didn't have much for facial features or much of anything going on. And this one too, what struck me about it is how it showed intelligence, how it looked at them, kind of as curiously as they were looking at it, kind of like it was trying to figure out what they were. Maybe it was thinking like, they look a little bit like me, but maybe not. Maybe it looked at them as dinner. Maybe it saw the gun and thought, well, it's not worth it. I'll go find an animal, and jumped off behind them. But what do you think? What do you think crawlers are? Why do you think that all the sightings are just popping up now? Or do you think that possibly they've kind of always had sightings, but it's just acceptable now to talk about them? Do you think that's what it is? Let me know down in the comments. And it's 3:37 in the morning where I am right now, so I will cut it off here. I've had a very long day, a fun day, but a long day. You guys know what I mean. So, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the LeafCast, and if you did, be sure to like and subscribe, and be prepared for Sunday's video. It's a wild one. As always, there's a PayPal and a Patreon in the description below, and of course there's super thanks here on YouTube. And with that, I think I'll see you on Sunday. Thank you for pulling up a stump, and thank you for watching.